and it's really lovely that we've got everybody with us this afternoon. So this is our SAR learning event, and it's being held on behalf of the Greenwich Safeguarding Adults Board. So today we'll be looking at two really important pieces of work. We're going to be looking at the Safeguarding Adults review for Lisa and the thematic review involving Max, Claire and Iliya. I've added the links to both of these reports in the chat. So if you haven't had a chance to look at these yet, please do take the opportunity afterwards to have a look at those in more detail. Just a couple of quick housekeeping bits before we get started. We will be recording the session so that we can share this with colleagues who are not able to attend today. So please can I ask that people keep their microphones on mute, and you're welcome to turn your cameras off if you don't want to be in the recording. That's absolutely fine. As we go along the presentations, if you do have any questions that come up or any reflections that you want to share, then please do put that in the chat, and we'll make some time after each presentation to go through any questions. So just pop them in the chat rather than putting your hands up. That's fine. It's got an hour and a half for today. We might be able to finish a bit earlier. Or you might be able to get a bit more of your afternoon back. We'll see how we go. We're going to do one presentation, have questions, and then the next presentation. So I'd just like to say a big thank you to our reviewers who are here with us today. So we've joined by Patrick Hopkinson, who authored the Thematic SAR, and Mike Ward, who led on SAR Lisa. And just to say thank you to both. We really appreciate all your time, expertise that you've brought to these reviews. Learning from SARS is such a crucial part of the Safeguarding Adults Board work, and it's so important that we continue to improve safeguarding practice across the partnership. So having as many people as we have today is really great. And also just to welcome some colleagues. I know we've got some people here from Bexley and from Lewisham. We did share this with our neighbouring boroughs. Obviously, the learning that we have from these reviews is not just applicable to Greenwich, so we felt it really important to share it with our colleagues in those boroughs as well. Okay, so I'm just going to start the recording and I'll hand over to yourself, Patrick, and then we'll get things going.
Thank you, Helen. So just give me a moment to just get this presentation up on the screen. So hopefully everyone will be able to see that. So welcome everybody, and thank you for coming to hear about these two safeguarding adult reviews. So I'll just introduce this one, the first one. This was a thematic review of three people who we named Max, Claire and Iliya. All the people were anonymised in the review. Now, just say a few words about thematic reviews is that unlike the single person review that Mike will be presenting after this one, the thematic reviews have to really by design swap depth of analysis for breadth of coverage. So in some ways, I won't be talking a huge amount about the individuals because, of course, we are looking at three people. And if we did three separate reviews, that would take quite a long time. The main purpose really of a thematic review is to really see about, well, what was similar, what was different and why, and what might we learn from that. And one of the challenges in all thematic reviews is that each person is, of course, unique. And their life experiences were their life experiences, and those are the people around them. And so sometimes when doing thematic reviews, sometimes you might actually have to explore something that's really important for an individual, may not necessarily be reflected in the lives of others. So that's one of the factors we'll come across in this one as well, because you really do have to balance that matter of trying to really do people justice within the review, as well as looking for broader concepts. So that's really just an introduction, really, so you get some idea about what the context, I suppose, of which I'll be talking about. And so I'll just move on and just explain a little bit about the three people who were part of the review. So Max. Now, Max was a 60-year-old Black British man. He lived alone and he'd had a long history of using mental health services and a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And Max's last admission in hospital had been in the February of the year that we're talking about. This was 2023. And Max didn't like taking medication, and there were also concerns that he was actually severely neglecting. Max was a guy that services struggled to engage with, and very often most of the positive engagement with him seemed to be almost by, not exactly by accident, but slightly by design, on the basis of meeting him in the street where he might be. That proved to be more successful sometimes than actually going and bringing Max or expecting Max to come into a service. Max was also known to use cocaine, but the extent of that really no one actually knew of. And concerns started mounting, even though Max had his last psychiatric hospital admission in February. Still concerns about his mental health, so that a mental health act assessment was planned to be carried out at his home on the 11th of July. If there were concerns really sufficient that Max actually needed treatment, and if he didn't want treatment, there was an arrangement made that the police would attend, or would hopefully attend, as we'll find out, to use Section 135, and they already got a warrant prepared for that one. Section 135, as you may know, of the Mental Health Act allows a police officer to enter into someone's home if they believe that the person's at risk, to convey them to a place of safety, which in this case would have been a hospital bed. However, obviously I'll put a spelling error in there. However, initially the police officers were unwilling to attend unless it was confirmed that a hospital bed was available. And there's a bit of learning about that one also for us in this we'll come to. When they did arrive, when the clinicians arrived, without the police in this case, they couldn't get an answer from Max on the door. And so they were concerned about him, and on that basis phoned the police, who then did come along and actually were able to enter into Max's flat, but couldn't find him there. Max was then reported missing, but unfortunately then was found deceased at home in his wardrobe a bit later in July. And sadly, Max's cause of death couldn't be determined. So that's Max. Move on to look at Claire. Now, Claire was a 39-year-old white British woman. She had history again of mental health problems, this case low mood, anxiety, and agoraphobia. She had suffered a facial disfigurement from drug use, and that may well have meant that she didn't want to go out, but it was unclear to the extent of that really there, and that relationship between the disfigurement and agoraphobia. She also had a history of self-harm and of suicidal thoughts, but hadn't been recorded to make any suicide attempts. Claire, however, had been the victim of quite significant domestic abuse from actually a partner who seemed to have been a serial abuser, and he was jailed for an assault upon her as a result of that in 2018. Claire did self-neglect, it appears, and also had a son who witnessed the abuse of her by a partner and who became estranged from her. Claire's mum, who lived abroad, was very insistent actually that community service and mental health services outreach to Claire and visited her at home because of her unwillingness to go to places and to attend medical appointments. That didn't always happen, and Claire died at home in October 2022, actually just the day before a multidisciplinary team was going to meet to discuss her needs and how they might be able to support her. We do have a cause of death for Claire, and it's essentially alcohol-related problems that caused her death. And Iliya. Now, Iliya was a 31-year-old white European man from Bulgaria. He spoke very little English, and communication was actually through his mum and his father, well, his mum predominantly, and sometimes a little bit through his dad, whom he lived with. And Iliya had been treated for paranoid schizophrenia in Bulgaria, but from what people were able to work out, the experience had not been a very positive one, and he had a great fear of being sectioned and forcibly treated by mental health services. There were also concerns, as well as his mental health needs, about Iliya's alcohol use, and successive attempts to really try to persuade Iliya by his GP and ambulance service, and also by his mum, to attend hospital for treatment for liver disease as a result of his alcohol use. However, Iliya was considered to have the mental capacity to be able to refuse to attend hospital for his treatment of his condition. However, persistence carried on, and after a third attempt, they did manage to convince him to go into hospital, but sadly he died there not long afterwards, and his cause of death was multiple organ failure. Again, that was underlying cause of liver disease. Again, a alcohol-related condition, and schizophrenia. So there are the three people that we considered in this review. And they had, as you can probably work out, a number of life experiences in common. They had mental health needs, there was substance use, all the people were considered at times to self-neglect. There was also, as we proceeded with the review, a recognition of the role of trauma in their lives, and also about domestic abuse. Laura quite clearly had experienced domestic abuse, whereas Iliya, it was less certain. But some of the information that was received suggested that his behavior towards his mother could be quite aggressive, could be quite abusive. We never really got to the bottom of that. People didn't know exactly what was happening there, but it was a concern. So, in terms of what we can learn from this review, I've highlighted their 6 areas, which I'm just going to cover. One is about domestic abuse, another one about self-neglect or self-care challenges, how we might approach those. One, of course, also always about mental capacity, which features very highly always in all safeguarding adult reviews. Another one about mental health needs, another about engagement with people who we struggle sometimes to actually work with, and also another one about the coordination of services. So I'm just going to just run through some of the learning from these. However, I thought I'd just start off just talking a little bit about domestic abuse, because some people may not necessarily be hugely familiar with it from not just from a safeguarding perspective, but more widely than that. Because we do have a Domestic Abuse Act. This defines what abusive behaviour is, and as you can see there, we have, I won't read them all out to you, I'm sure you can read it on the screen, but as you'll see, a lot of those are very similar to the 10 examples of types of abuse and neglect that we have in the Care Act statutory guidance. So there's quite a deal of overlap really there between what's considered as domestic abuse and what we also would consider as safeguarding. This is a point for us to bear in mind. However, for it to be domestic abuse, there are also some other criteria that have to be met. Both parties have to be over the age of 16. So again, it's slightly different from our adult safeguarding criteria, where we really are looking at 18-year-olds, but particularly that the people who are experiencing abuse or are causing abuse or being abusive have to be personally connected. So what does personally connected mean? Well, we do have, therefore, in the Act, helpfully, a definition of that. Again, I won't read all of these out to you, but just summarising it, as you will see, key points to bear in mind about personal connection are that two people are in a relationship, regardless whether it's a formal one or not, or have been in a personal relationship. It doesn't have to be a current one. One of the things that we know is particularly important and a particular risk factor in domestic abuse is stalking an abusive partner following their person, that the partner they've been abusing, up after the relationship has ended. You'll also see that it can be that you have had a relationship where you had a child, even though you're not in that relationship anymore. That would also meet the definition of personally connected. And finally, one that's really relevant for us is relatives. Remember that people who are living in or are part of a family are personally connected, and so therefore the abusive behavior between a son and a mother, or between a father and a daughter, or whoever it may be, could meet the definition of domestic abuse. And so there is a connection between our work in health and social care and domestic abuse, and particularly a bit I want to highlight here is about mental health needs. We know that people who are abused often develop mental health needs. We know that people with mental health needs are often more at risk of being domestically abused. And we know that having mental health needs often creates additional vulnerabilities which a perpetrator of domestic abuse may seek to exploit and use to threaten the person with reporting them to mental health services, to have them sectioned, etc., etc. We also know that there's a strong association between suicide and domestic abuse. In fact, you may be familiar with the domestic homicide reviews, which are sort of parallel in the domestic abuse world to our normal safeguarding adult reviews. But the name of those is now changing to domestic abuse related death reviews. And the reason for that is that over the past few years, the majority of domestic homicide reviews have been about suicide, not homicide. So there is very much a strong element of domestic abuse in our work in both health and social care. And despite that strong link, we still know there are problems that we experience, and particularly the research evidence focuses upon mental health practitioners, though it may not just be them, who struggle to identify the presence of domestic abuse in their work with their clients. And some of the reasons for that have been suggested about low levels of inquiry are made. It's very difficult sometimes in clinical sessions to think about opportunities to ask questions about relationships and people's experiences, lack of training and awareness, and also the fact that often what we do is treat the symptoms rather than the causes. So we will treat someone for depression, we'll treat someone for anxiety without necessarily looking about why that might be caused. So that's the context really that I've just wanted to set about domestic abuse. So what we learn really from this review is that there are no ideal victims. Often we like to imagine that what we will find is a victim of domestic abuse who is wholly perfect and innocent and has never been involved in any problems or anything like that. Often we don't, however. Often we find that victims are sometimes also perpetrators of domestic abuse too. And sometimes that may be because it's retaliatory. It was a protective thing. Someone fights back, then they're the one that gets into trouble. But it's a bit for us to recognise. It's very unlikely we're going to find someone who looks perfectly as a victim. And victim blame can often affect our recognition and response to domestic abuse. Often it's very easy for us to fall into the trap of blaming the victim for what has happened to them. So it's a bit for us to watch out for. Also, we have law that we have to remember to use. Now, in Claire's situation particularly, as I say, her partner was a serial domestic abuser. He was known to have abused previous partners. And back in 2016, before the events we're looking at, he'd also assaulted Claire, but she had refused to press charges against him. However, looking at the records, it seems that actually people at the time hadn't taken the opportunity to inform her about her partner's domestic abuse history. People have what's called Clare's Law. Well, we have Clare's Law, which actually gives people the right to ask the police about the partner they have and see whether or not the person has a history or a prosecution for domestic abuse. But people also have the right to know. We have a responsibility to tell people that their partner has been prosecuted or is known for domestic abuse. So it's remembering about using the powers that we have in the law to inform victims about the risks they may be facing. Also important to be aware of intergenerational domestic abuse. Domestic abuse, hopefully as I clarified earlier on, is not just something between couples. It can exist within families. It can exist across generations. So there's a bit for us to watch out for. As I say, there were some concerns about Iliya and his mother. Nobody ever really got to the bottom of what was going on there, but some suspicions were arising. Another factor also for us, and I know Mike will be, I think, considering quite a lot about suicide risk later, but also about the risk of suicide in the context of domestic abuse. Claire was scared that a partner who had been put into prison might harm her when he moved into open prison conditions. As a result of this, she seemed to be getting very anxious and self-harming. However, this wasn't responded to. And also, one of the bits that I'm very keen on that we consider actually when working with people who are at risk of suicide, as in, for example, in domestic abuse situations, is about some preparatory work with them using what are called suicide safety plans. And I'll just give you a quick rundown of the sorts of things a suicide safety plan might contain. The idea really with this is actually what we try to do is work with people before they start to behave in a suicidal way or think very strongly about suicide. And so some of the things that could go into a suicide safety plan, and this would be created with the person we're concerned about, would be, to get the person to think about, what reasons do I have for living? What are the good things in life? What has helped me in the past to actually get through difficult times? What have I achieved? How have I done that? Think about ways also that you could make your situation safer. Again, this could also include removal of any of some of the more obvious items that someone might use for suicide. Of course, it's very difficult to do, but it could be an option to consider there. Identifying ways the person might actually lift their mood or calm themselves. things that might distract you from your suicidal thoughts and ruminations, and also who to talk to. So the idea of the suicide safety plans really is it's an intervention we make with people earlier rather than later, before the person at you, because sometimes, as we know, people can move from thinking about suicide to actually attempting suicide very, very quickly. The idea with this is actually getting there before that cycle happens. So that's suicide. Another one for us really is what we might learn about self-neglect. And again, I've just following on really from what we talked about with domestic abuse, is that there is a connection between domestic abuse and self-neglect. I think it's probably not too hard to imagine that if you are being abused and coercively controlled by someone who is controlling your money, who is making you fearful, often your ability to look after yourself, to have time to look after yourself, is limited. And so sometimes self-neglect might be an indication of abuse that's taking place. And again, another thing that we identified there was also about using the law that we have that relates to self-neglect. And this, things like using care act assessments and using whatever opportunities we've got there actually to be able to see what the person's needs are, engage with people about what their needs are, seeing if we can have that conversation. That didn't really seem to be in the case for Max, Claire, and Iliya. I know we often do this, but there is a matter here that the board was looking at in terms of the sharing of responsibilities between mental health services and social services for the use of the care act responsibilities for people with mental health services. And so that's an area that was being reviewed. So it's remembering the importance of the law, regardless whether you work in mental health services or regardless whether you work in social services, about being sure that you're aware of the powers and the responsibilities that the care act gives you. Also, a need to develop further practice. I'm sure you're very much aware of this, but about these issues about identifying signs of self-neglect, how do we spot it? Use of history taking to be able to understand the person's background who's self-neglecting. Often we find there might be some information in the background that might suggest to us why the person is doing this. Might give us some opportunities really therefore to find ways to intervene, topics to talk to them about, ways to get involved in their lives, things to interest them in. On that basis, really, but hopefully what we might use is create and use moments of motivation. Might give us opportunities for intervention. Also, remember there is local guidance. There are policies and procedures and protocols about working with self-neglect. Use them. Mentioned about understanding legal powers of duty, and also about ensuring that actually we think multi-agency when we're working with people with self-neglect. From my experience, and I'm sure it's the case with a lot of people, other people's, and also from being a safeguarding adult review writer now for many years, one of the things that comes across constantly is that we don't think multi-agency early enough. We often think it's our job to struggle, to try to work with the person as best we can do, but often it's too complicated for you as an individual practitioner to be able to do everything that someone who self-neglects needs. And so consequently, really important that what we start thinking about doing is how do we engage different agencies in this work? We've all got a role to play. Mental capacity, really key bit that came out in this thematic review was really about greater attention to the impact of long-term trauma and alcohol and substance use on people's mental capacity, and being very clear about that we need to assess capacity in a decision-specific manner, but also having a look at capacity and decisions people have made over a period of time to really get a picture about really what does the person really understand? What information do they really retain? What information, when it comes to the crunch, do they use and weigh when they make their decision? So that's an important bit for us to be focusing upon. Bit that particularly came out in this one about mental health needs was, I think, as I mentioned for Max, is that at the time the police officers' attendance to support a mental health act assessment and use Section 135 powers as necessary depended on the availability of beds. That shouldn't be how it works. The police officers in this case, however, did attend using PACE. But again, it's an important bit that actually we need to do the assessments, not be only thinking about doing them if the result is the one that we want. The assessment itself is really important anyway. Also about need, and again, I know Mark will be talking about this one as well, particularly a need to develop a real strong working relationship between mental health and substance use services. We have them as two separate sorts of services, but I'm sure if you work with people with mental health problems, you will know that a majority or a very significant proportion of those people with mental health problems will also have substance use needs, and we know this is a difficult challenge for us. There are joint working arrangements, something called COMHAD, which is a co-occurring mental health, alcohol and drug service, but it's limited. And so one of the proposals from this review was really it needs to be expanded because we know this is a struggle, this is an area we struggle with. It's a really important one in both mental health, substance use and self-neglect. Engagement. Well, really what we might learn about that one is to expect it to be difficult. The fact that often people who are self-neglecting need our help is the very fact that they don't want help. And so it's about realizing, in fact, that we need to be flexible. We need to think about ways of engaging people in a way that makes sense to them. Sometimes it might require some negotiation. Sometimes it might require some compromise. Sometimes it might involve meeting the people where they wish to be met, talking about things they want to talk about, but keeping that relationship going is really, really important. And use resources. As I mentioned, Iliya was a speaker of Bulgarian, had very limited English capacity or English ability. His GP really effectively used an interpreter actually frequently in meetings because that helped both him and his mum to communicate, and also helped actually significantly to convince Iliya of the need to be admitted to hospital, even though it probably was too late by that time to save his life. The final bit I just want to cover before I look at just some changes and recommendations, and I'll come to an end, is that yeah, we need to also learn about coordination, multi-agency working and working with family members. Important to remember to offer people carers assessments, and that's not just the social services responsibility to offer them. People can be signposted to them, or they can be suggested to people by anyone. Consider also in relationships, again, back onto domestic abuse, but some of the things about working with families, really important bit to be thinking about the presence of coercion and control in relationships and looking for signs and indicators that might be the case. It might be, therefore, something where you might want to engage or consider trying to engage specialist domestic abuse services in it. And remember about using those multi-agency approaches, use safeguarding concerns, get people together around the table to discuss what options there are and different ways of intervening, what each partner might bring to the table. I know sometimes that can be difficult because sometimes nobody wants to come along to a meeting to be picking up another client, but it's really important that what we do is recognize that when we get called to come to these meetings, then it's actually because people hope we might be able to provide at least some advice or suggestions rather than just take over a case. Action already has been taken on a number of these factors. Well, the bits that have been raised in the review. There is a suicide prevention strategy, which I'm hoping will include suicide safety plans and hopefully also about risks of suicide from domestic abuse. Mental health trust is using more therapeutic approaches now as well to engage people who have histories of trauma. The police have got the right care, right person processes in place. It'll be interesting to see how effectively those are working. And there's now, however, considerably greater relationship between the AMP team and the police in terms of how we might respond to requests for assessments as well. So hopefully that will deal with some of the factors we identified in the review. Mental health trust has also been doing training specifically about people who hoard or self-neglect, and there's using the hoarding and self-neglect toolkit. There's also training staff, as you can see there, in when to actually think multi-agency, which is, I say, is a really vital bit. And also, I've been told there is an improved relationship now between the Mental Health Trust and the new Drug and Alcohol Service. So they're the things that have altered. So I'll just end on just running through some of the recommendations that were made. So these were that training packages should include modules on trauma, avoiding victim blame, mental capacity, and making services accessible to meeting people's needs. In Greenwich, we have a make every opportunity count approach, and also there is making every contact count approach run by the NHS. That should actually run through all that we're doing in terms of trying to engage with people, offer assessments, offer support, spot self-neglect and domestic abuse, and also make safeguarding interventions. So hopefully that can be joined up together. When someone discloses domestic abuse, make referrals to the appropriate agencies. There are domestic abuse agencies operating in Greenwich. Also consider about things like the right to ask and the right to know, just making sure people are aware of this. And of course, all of that's independent of whether the person actually wants to engage. I mean, the engagement has to be consensual, but there's no harm in talking about these things. Be aware, again, of practical needs that people might have. Again, offer those assessments, offer advice. Yeah, make your work person-centered really as much as you can do with people. Also, a specific bit there for the Mental Health Trust and for Greenwich was to consider how effective this Section 75 agreement is working in terms of making sure that safeguarding concerns are raised and responded to. This is when people with mental health problems and care and support needs are assessed and care assessments are offered. Also, where there aren't any of those COMAD, those coexisting mental health and drug and alcohol point services available or posts available, it's about how might we actually increase that collaboration between mental health services and drug and alcohol services. And that's everything. So if I stop now, it's about half an hour, so it gives us a few minutes for questions. So thank you everybody for listening. Any questions?
I can't see any questions in the chat,
Okay.
so if anybody's got any they want to put their hands up, please feel free.
Okay. Obviously, I gave you everything you needed.
You obviously did such a good job,
Yeah,
Patrick. Yeah.
obviously. Right. Okay. Well,
All
thank you
right.
everybody for listening. Anyway, that's good. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to hand over to Mike now. He's going to talk about SAR Lisa. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Helen, and thanks to Patrick for that great presentation. There will, as Patrick's kind of indicated, be overlaps between what I say about Lisa and what he said about the three people in his review. I'm going to share slides as Patrick did, so let me just put those up. There we go. And I'll talk through these. I mean, again, I don't particularly mind if people want to interrupt me or put questions in as we go along. But as Patrick did, I will leave space at the end for questions, and hopefully maybe what we say here in this presentation will spark some joint questions to Patrick and myself. Okay, so we're talking about Lisa. That is obviously a pseudonym. She was a 43-year-old white British woman, actually a local woman, and she died in April 2023. Tragically, she completed suicide by hanging in woods near her home using a dog leash from her own dog. She had family. She had two daughters who seemed to have had ongoing involvement with her, but does not seem to have had an intimate partner in many years. She had mental health problems. There were drug use disorders, possibly alcohol use disorder, and she does have a history of epilepsy. Now, it's worth remembering when you look at safeguarding adult reviews that they do not look at the person's whole life. That would be a task too great for this process. What we focus on is April 21 to April 23 in this particular review. And that does mean that some of the things that may have gone on earlier in her life, we're not as well cited on. I know a bit about her earlier life, but we don't know everything about what happened to her and the journey to the point where she completes suicide. Now, as I said, she clearly had a drug use disorder. We can see that was a problem for her from at least 2008 and was certainly ongoing at the time of her death. And she was reported to have used ecstasy, cocaine, LSD, cannabis. However, as far as I can tell, she doesn't seem to have had any contact with drug and alcohol services locally, which is a point we may need to dwell on. Now, in terms of her drug use disorder, one of the key things that caused problems was that she was constantly under threat from drug dealers. She reported, certainly in the last months of her life, owing considerable sums of money to drug dealers. And her suicide note suggests that those debts led to her suicide. It was that pressure that drove her to complete suicide. She also seems to have been in a wider set of relationships with what you might call friends. I think she would have regarded them as friends, but there does seem to have been a pattern of abuse and exploitation from these friends to her. But equally, there are mentions of her being aggressive to other people. And that does link into the point that Patrick made, that victims and perpetrators may at times share similarities. And a key feature here is that Lisa was resistant to her abuse being reported to the police. In particular, because she was scared of what would happen if she did report these drug dealers to the police, and you can understand the risks she would have been running. But I suppose that does link across to what we see in domestic abuse as well, where people may be resistant to reporting domestic abuse. And we probably have made more efforts to try and help people to report domestic abuse. But one of the points they make in this report and in the recommendations is we do need to think about how we can help people like Lisa to talk about this abuse and get help from it without putting herself in danger, which is a challenge. There's no doubt about it, but it is a real question and not one that comes up just in this Lisa SAR. I've seen it in other safeguarding adult reviews as well. Now, she had been known to mental health services since 2007. She's got diagnoses of depression, possibly other conditions. She'd had 6 mental health inpatient admissions up until 2020, none in the period. She had 6 mental health inpatient admissions from 2010 to 2020. And during that period, there were several attempts to end her own life. We have to acknowledge that the clinical response that she got from mental health services was generally very good. And Lisa herself seemed very positive about the care she received. Now, because she's got alcohol and drug problems, drug and alcohol problems, and a mental health problem as well, as Patrick indicated, it brings us into the realm of co-occurring disorders, what has sometimes been called dual diagnosis. And Patrick has already mentioned that the Trust has a service, COMAD, for this condition, these combined problems. Lisa was not involved in that service. That's not a criticism of the Trust or the COMAD service. I think it's a reality of the very limited resource that is available for this. And also the fact that the service was largely focused on getting people to engage with mental health services. People with substance misuse services, getting them to engage with mental health services. That wasn't Lisa's situation. It was the other way round. But that is, as Patrick said, I think an area for work and consideration, how we can extend the work of that kind of service. Very powerfully and very movingly, Lisa left us a note about why she had completed suicide. And it reads, and you can see it here, "I've done this because a drug dealer is demanding another £800 from me. His name is included, his address is included." And then she goes on to say, "I'm also dead because all my friends take the piss. I've had enough of my life. I'm in a better place now. Tell my daughter I love her and would be looking down on her from a better place. Bye, cruel world. Please take," and that's the name of her dog, "to be put to sleep so he will be with me." And it's worth mentioning in terms of the dog that actually the dog itself was very unwell. And there was a real concern that if the dog died, that could also be an indicator that Lisa would complete suicide. So that role of animals in people's lives can be very significant. Now, that's a picture of Lisa. And the question is really whether... Sorry, did someone come in there? Or was it just a blip? Okay. The question is, therefore, whether appropriate steps were taken to safeguard her. And Patrick set out a number of themes, and some of these overlap with Patrick's themes. There are things around safeguarding, things around risk assessment and risk management, the response to co-occurring disorders, the possibility of residential options, multi-agency management, and to a lesser extent, the impact of COVID. Because clearly some of that 21-23 period intersected with the COVID lockdowns. Now, in terms of safeguarding, Lisa, it is unclear whether safeguarding concerns were raised about her during the review period and whether the steps taken to safeguard her were sufficient. And I think Patrick talked a bit about the safeguarding role, and there were questions for us about the safeguarding process within the trust. The safeguarding for people with mental health problems has been devolved to the trust, and we did have some problems in sort of tracking safeguarding concerns and thinking about what the exact process was for managing safeguarding concerns in that context. More specifically, and one that I think is generalizable to other SARs across the country, is the question of whether that presentation as a drug user, even as a drug user who was being exploited by drug dealers, was seen by people as a safeguarding issue. So there are a number of questions there about safeguarding, about process, about whether enough concerns were raised about her, and about whether attitudes and perceptions of people like Lisa impact on the safeguarding process. We need to remember that safeguarding is a wider process than just sending a safeguarding concern to the local authority. And it was positive that she was considered for safeguarding by other means, for example, referring her to a problem premises panel because of concerns about her living circumstances. And there is again that question that I raised earlier about can we help people like Lisa to report their abuse and exploitation to the police, which would have been a very significant way of safeguarding her from that abuse. Again, Patrick talked about multi-agency management. There are a number of themes that emerge in SAR after SAR across the country, and multi-agency management is another of those. Essentially, probably because the key question in SARS is whether agencies work together effectively to protect the individual. But I think in this case, there was a clear perception that Lisa would have benefited from more regular multi-agency discussion. Now, that could have happened in any number of ways, via a safeguarding process, via an individual care coordinator calling a meeting, by referring her into a group like the problem premises panel. There are a number of means for doing this. Whichever way we do it, I think one of the key themes across both Patrick and my work is the importance of a multi-agency framework for the management of these clients. And in particular, an ongoing multi-agency framework. I think that there needs to be longer term management through multi-agency frameworks. Again, certainly something that Patrick picked up, and something that has been picked up nationally. And in fact, the SAB chairs, Safeguarding Adult Board chairs nationally, are doing some work on this at the moment. There is this question of kind of skilling up practitioners to work with people that they find difficult to engage in services. For many of the clients that we are talking about, the problem is not that they have a mental health problem or that they have a substance misuse problem. The problem is that they are challenging to engage into the services that would help them with those problems. And that needs to be tackled at two levels. We need individual professionals to have training on engaging individuals, things like motivational interventions, harm reduction interventions. But at the organisational level, it highlights the need for clear multi-agency procedures that support professionals in dealing with people like Lisa, who they're finding it hard to engage into services. Because the reality is that many of the people who come into health and social care do present problems of engagement. But we can't use the same assertive multi-agency approach with all of those individuals. We need to be able to work out who are those individuals who are posing the greatest level of risk or vulnerability and who therefore warrant what a colleague of mine called a more sticky service, a service that tries to hold on to them. And beyond that, there are questions about how do we escalate concerns beyond that engagement process. Now, Lisa was certainly impacted by her substance use disorders. If she hadn't been substance misusing, she wouldn't have been in a position where she was being exploited by drug dealers. It did make her vulnerable. And one of the very basic things that I say in the report is that as a discipline, services need to be screening all their clients or patients or customers for drug and alcohol problems. That's not my idea. That's government guidance. That's NICE guidance. That's Department of Health guidance. And when we're looking at drugs, the Department of Health advocates services using something called Assist Light. And if you Google that, you'll find the tool on the gov.uk website. And it's just a basic screening tool. Now, Lisa would certainly have benefited from contact with drug and alcohol services, but it does seem that the prevailing model, as it is in many areas of the country, was that the individual needed to be motivated to engage with services. Lisa wasn't motivated. And therefore, for some clients, possibly including Lisa, there is a need for more assertive services, assertive outreach services, which build a relationship with her and try and explore and understand what lay behind this refusal of care. I think, and there is some evidence for this, that Lisa would have benefited from residential rehabilitation. And that's something that was mooted around in her case, but never moved to the front of the agenda. And I think that does reflect that over the last 10, 20 years, there has been a decline in the use of residential rehab with drug and alcohol users. But I think it is something that we do need to remember can be very helpful for clients, and pathways into it should be able to accommodate people like Lisa. Now, this I've mentioned already. I'm really repeating what I said earlier. Again, I'm complimenting the Trust in terms of having that co-occurring condition service, but both the Trust and commissioners need to think about how we can extend the brief of that. And that's been reinforced in the last 3 or 4 months since I finished writing this report. So it's not mentioned in the report. But the Department of Health have published new guidance on a new delivery framework for co-occurring disorders in this country, and which is really very strongly arguing that in particular mental health services do need to get involved in managing co-occurring disorders. It's good that Oxley's are, but it clearly needs to be extended. There are some quite specific questions about risk and risk management. In the last weeks of her life, there were some very swiftly changing assessments of the level of risk. For example, the zoning system within the trust varied in terms of how she was ragged, often on a day-to-day basis. And there was a conflicting risk assessment where on the one hand she was assessed as low risk, and on another hand, or on the other hand, was assessed as being quite significantly risky. All of those individual decisions may be explicable, but when you bring them into the wider context, it does seem to suggest a need for some review of that process. With people like Lisa, levels of risk simply don't change that quickly. The surface presentation may seem to suggest that there is a change, but underpinning this, she is a woman with key markers for risk, particularly risk of suicide. But that's not just about the trust. There were general comments that many agencies needed to be trained to better assess risk. So that runs across the partnership. Patrick is linked across to this role of suicidality and domestic abuse. And again, I think if I'd written the report more recently, this is something that I would have talked about because it's certainly come up the agenda. And we've had, court cases where we're seeing people who've committed or perpetrated domestic abuse being linked to suicides and being prosecuted for their role in those suicides. Someone just put their hand up. I don't know if that's... Now, Lisa was not a victim of domestic abuse, but she was the victim of other abuse. And I think those same messages about domestic abuse and suicidality could be applied to drug dealers who are abusing and exploiting people like Lisa. They are driving them to suicidality. And we need to see it in that same kind of context. If we pull all this together, what I've tried to think about, and it's not set out in this way in the report, but this is what underpins the report. Ultimately, when you're looking at high impact, high risk individuals like Lisa, there are a number of steps that we probably need to take. We need to be able to identify her as someone who needs more escalated help. And it may be that there needs to be some kind of screening tool that helps to identify who is going to need a more assertive response. Once identified, there needs to be capacity to escalate them into a multi-agency framework. Ideally, such clients would get a care coordinator. They would be greatly helped by having assertive interventions, harm reduction interventions, motivational interventions. Ultimately, legal frameworks maybe need to be used. The Care Act. Patrick talked about the Mental Capacity Act, and I agree with him that it's a central issue in many SARs. I have to say it didn't come out in this SAR as a central theme, but it is certainly a theme that does require attention generally. And ultimately, in some ways, if we can do nothing else, as we're doing with Lisa, we need to learn lessons when things go wrong about services and about training needs. So I've made a number of recommendations. The first of them is about safeguarding. We need to recognise that people who are being exploited as a result of involvement with drug dealers are not making a lifestyle choice and may require safeguarding. We need to make sure that all agencies are raising safeguarding concerns about people like Lisa. At one point in her care, she was chaperoned to an appointment by unknown men, two unknown men, one of whom came into the appointment with her. And really making, I think, what is ought to be the obvious point, that when those individuals come in, if they're unknown to the worker and they don't understand what they're doing, questions need to be asked about that. We need to make sure that the safeguarding process within the trust is clear and straightforward. We also need to be clear that client consent is not a requisite for submitting a safeguarding concern. And technically, although we have a Section 75 agreement in place in the borough and across the tri-borough area, the local authorities do need to be able to track safeguarding concerns within the trust, because they still hold statutory responsibility for those concerns. More simply, we need to make sure that screening tools like Assist Light, like Audit for Alcohol, are being used widely in frontline services to identify drug and alcohol problems. We need consideration of whether we need to expand or develop assertive outreach capacity in the drug and alcohol system. And we need to make sure that residential rehab is available for people like Lisa. We need to think about that expansion of the COMAD role. We need a review of the risk system that I identified in the Mental Health Trust, but also wider risk assessment and risk management training across the partnership. We need procedures to support people, professionals, to understand how to respond to people like Lisa that they find difficult to engage. And there should be opportunities to escalate people like Lisa into joint management frameworks, multi-agency management frameworks. And of course that can happen locally, but we need to be clear. There needs to be clear pathways for people in Lisa's situation into those multi-agency frameworks. And finally, and undoubtedly very contentious, but one that a nettle that sort of needs to be grasped nationally, is to think about how people like Lisa can safely report concerns about threats from drug dealers, because quite clearly in Lisa's case, she didn't feel safe in doing that. And again, I've taken just about half an hour, and I'll stop sharing the slides. And again, Helen, I'm happy to throw it open to other people. Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you so much, Mike. That was really, really good. We haven't got any questions in the chat, so just throwing it open to everyone here. Has anyone got any reflections or questions? Tina, going to come to you. Oh, the hand's gone.
Yeah, sorry, that was the mistake. I do apologise.
Okay.
Okay.
We got all excited then, Tina.
Well, I just find, you know, everything that's been said by both you gentlemen, it was brilliant.
Thank you.
But the main thing I kind of get from this, and I sit next to the safeguarding team in the office, and they try so very hard for people to allow them to put them in contact with the different agencies out there that can potentially help them. And they tell them, no one has to know and so on. But it's just getting those people to accept that help. And I find that is one of the most frustrating and difficult things for anybody that's going through any sort of abuse or anything where they need our help. So if they're not going to engage, then it makes the job so much harder.
Yes, I mean, that's absolutely right, Tina. And I think that's one of the points I was making, that we need to help workers to understand what they do next in that situation, because this is commonplace. And yesterday I was in a meeting and they used the phrase, the difference between a hard referral and a soft referral. And I think the hard referral was where you simply give people telephone numbers and say, why don't you ring these people? And a soft referral was where you built a pathway for the person. I may have got that the wrong way round. But I think we do need to think about referral as being more than just telephone numbers, leaflets, advice. We do need to build pathways. We need to build bridges for people between where they are and where they need to be.
I mean, he was being abused, I believe, and by his son, and the young lady concerned was trying her very best to sort of guide him and say, I can do the referral for you. And he was just, no, thank you for getting in touch. She said, but I'm still going to do these referrals for you. And if you take them up on it, then that's fine. But again, it's the case of we just can't force people to take that pathway, can we? As much as we know what's going on, we just can't force them.
Well, there is a longer pathway than that. And ultimately, the example you've given is triggers issues about inherent jurisdiction. Sometimes when we're going to get into cases where people are being abused by other people and appear to have the capacity to refuse that help, it does open up questions about inherent jurisdiction. There's a very notable court case of Southend-on-Sea versus Mayers, which is about exactly that situation. And I'm not saying that your worker needs to be on top of that, but there needs to be a process upwards, which then opens up the conversation about those possibilities. We need to keep pushing it up if someone is risky and vulnerable, not simply close it down because they haven't accepted the help.
And it is still difficult, isn't it? That's all I'm saying.
No doubt it's difficult. Absolutely.
And the safeguarding team, I hear them so many times. They're doing their utmost.
Yeah, I'm
to
sure
give
they
are. And you listen and you just think, as much as you are trying, this person has made it clear that you can do all you want, but we're not going to engage.
Yeah.
And it's just, I feel for them and for us when we go out to see people and we identify things. And the thing is, a lot of these people do have capacity as well, don't they?
Yeah.
And we're told, why are you interfering? It's got nothing to do with you.
Well,
so
we may need to cut this one down, but as Patrick has said, there are questions then about whether that person really does have mental capacity, and we need to think about how we understand mental capacity in this context.
Okay, well, thank you anyway. I said what I needed to say. Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you, Tina. Okay, we'll come to Gifty. You've got your hand up.
Yes, hi. Thank you for a very well presented presentation. And I think you guys have delved into some of the issues. As a care coordinator, one of the things I have found extremely difficult is when you're working with clients who have a background of substance misuse, both post and current. And, you try to link them up either with VIA or with other, drugs and alcohol services. and they just simply do not want to engage. I remember I had a client and she was in similar situation, and we tried everything else. And I suggested that they go into rehab, and they said no, that we're not ready to do so. On the other side, they were so vulnerable to the point where they live, drug dealers hang around. And because they know she was a regular customer, even when she tried to dissociate from them, they would still turn up at her door. It was just very, very, worrying, because you can't make a person do what they don't want to do, even though you know full well what it is that is needed. How do we mitigate that? Because like the previous contributor said, you can't force people. You can only try to make sure you signpost them and to an extent direct them. You work collaboratively with them to try to get them the help that they need, but ultimately it is their decision. And a lot of the time, our client groups just simply don't want to engage. How do we mitigate that?
Well, I've said a bit about. Patrick, do you want to say something? I can say
Yeah.
more on this because I can talk about
Yeah.
this endlessly.
Yeah, that's
Patrick,
all
if you
right.
want to.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, it's a challenge. And of course, what we can't do is expect to, there is no magic incantation, there's no magic words, there's nothing that we can actually do that will suddenly, there's no sort of secret knowledge that's been kept from everybody that will actually open people's doors and get people to engage with us. And there is, I mean, and it is really, I suppose, the evidence that we get, particularly from safeguarding art reviews, is trying to just understand the reasons, thinking about what is the reason why this person isn't engaging, even though, as you can see, quite objectively, their life is troubled. There are problems in their life, and is it because of the addiction? Is it because of the substance dependency, for example? And if it is, then you possibly have roots, therefore, through the Mental Capacity Act, because I mean it's quite clear that people's decisions can be influenced by or the impairment in the function of mind or brain can be caused by something like substance dependency, for example. It's a hardish argument sometimes to put, but it can be done, and there are case law examples where it's been done. Also, what is there anything in the person's background that might motivate them? Is there anything that actually they want to do? Is there anything you can find actually that would make sort of a deal in some ways? It's partly about negotiation sometimes, and sometimes it's a challenge for us because, of course, we come at these things with statutory and professional responsibilities, and in reality, it's almost like we should be taking more of an approach, I think, of bargaining sometimes might be a thing that might work. And again, I mean, I'm not saying these are the magical solutions that will do it. I'm sure everybody here is really, really experienced about working with people who are hard to engage with. And I think that Mike's right that what we need to do is actually in some ways make this not just a practitioner problem, it's a managerial and an organisation and a service-wide problem. What do we do collectively, and how might you be given training opportunities, skills, all those sorts of things that better at doing it, and sessions like this when we can discuss it and let's actually out in the open. Because as I say, I don't have any magic words, sadly. If there were, I'd have made a fortune out of it, or I'd let you know what they are. But yeah, it is about let's own up to this problem, that this is a challenge that we get, and let's collectively do it and make this a managerial and organisation strategy matter, not just something that individual practitioners struggle with. How's that, Mike? Is that any different from what you might have said?
No, I agree entirely, but I think there is a magic word, and the magic word is time.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
And I think often when people talk to me, because I spend my whole life talking about this issue of clients who don't want to engage in services, and what people want is some fairly quick fix for this. And I can promise you there is no quick fix for this. What works, and for example, in 2018, I spent part of my time supervising an assertive outreach service in Surrey that worked with chronic dependent drinkers and drug users. In that year, that service was referred 48 people. The service engaged 47 of them. And the reason they engaged them is because they took a long time to do it. They just kept on working and working and working. And too often we don't have the time or the resources to do that kind of relationship building. And that's really what you need. And I think we all know, and at some level, I'm talking the bleeding obvious. But But what you need to do is to take the time to build a relationship. And that isn't, I'm not saying you as workers are failing to do this. Organizations are not giving workers the time and the framework to do that with the most complex clients. And you can't do it with everyone because there's too many clients to do that. But when you've got someone who's really complex, very risky, the system should allow workers to have that time to do relationship building. And that's probably what works.
Thanks, Mike and Patrick. And just to that point, Lizette and Julie have put in the chat that exact thing about building relationships is the key to engagement, but we don't always have the time and resources to do this.
Yes. I should have just let Lizette do it.
Yeah, you got it. Yeah.
Okay, fab. Okay, coming to Gary now.
Hi, Mike. Good presentation, by the way. One of your recommendations was for the local authority to be able to track all safeguarding across the trust. I was just curious as to what caused you to make this recommendation from this case.
As the author, I was given information about safeguarding, and it wasn't always clear how the safeguarding process had operated and what had happened to safeguarding concerns. I think that's the reason. And I think it's, I don't want to go too far into this, but it's something that I've seen happen in other areas. Trusts are so big, and it's very easy for safeguarding concerns to get a bit lost in mental health trusts. And we do need to make sure that that the process is clear and manageable. Because it is still, whether it's devolved to the trust or not, is still a local authority responsibility. They are responsible legally for the safeguarding concerns.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, and Julie, you've got a question.
I work in children's services, and I suppose the first thing that hits me is the similarity between outcomes and reviews that adults and children are finding, and I'm not sure we share that learning enough together. But also we do have a team in Greenwich Children's Services that works specifically with mothers that have had repeated removals of their children, and 99% of the time they have a number of the combined complexities and problems and issues that you've talked about: substance misuse, domestic abuse, mental health, learning difficulties, housing issues. So these are some of our most vulnerable members of our community, and they, as you were saying, Mike, have a trauma-informed relationship-based practice, which organisationally has changed, works very differently, I suppose, and has also had a very, very high level of being able to work with women that previously were considered, inverted commas, hard to engage. And it's something about us needing to understand that actually we're, as services, really difficult to reach and really difficult to engage as well. And no matter what practitioners do without that organisational change, it won't happen. It won't happen. We have to do it as a wide organisation. The other thing is, the one thing that we're quite often told is why we can't do that is because of finances, because it's too expensive. Well, actually, what we've found with the PAWS team is that we have considerable cost benefits, because actually these women will be having housing issues, they will be coming to substance misuse services, they will have A&E attendances. There's lots of things that are very expensive, police call outs across the borough, which actually cost a lot more than working with a high level outreach team that works from a trauma-informed perspective and relational perspective over a period of a year or 18 months, when you have better outcomes for them in the longer term, and also that we have sustained change. We've seen sustained change for these women. So there's something about the shared learning between adults and children's, because we're working with the same you know, if we think family, we're working with the same client groups, but also without that organisational shift and understanding that actually it's a money saving opportunity to have small teams that work with specifically vulnerable and complex parts of the community, same community, then it's not going to change, and we're going to end up with similar reviews in the future.
Yeah. You should have done the presentation, Julie. That's absolutely right.
That's very good.
I mean,
Okay.
I have to say, I'm sorry, I'm talking too much, and Patrick should just shut me up.
Yeah.
But people do often say to me that, you know, when we ask the question, how do we work with difficult to engage individuals? The answer is look at children's services. Children's services are operating the model that I said. That's what happens in children's services. So we do have a model there.
Right. Thank you, Julie. And also somebody to put in the chat, Sherry put in the chat about including people with lived experience when looking at reviewing policies around people that are, in commas, hard to engage.
Yeah.
Okay, and we've got Lakeisha, you've just put your hand up, so I'm going to come to you.
Yes, hi, thank you. I just wanted to say in regards to, I mean, reflecting, it seemed the assertive outreach model, which was implemented some years ago, that seemed to work really, really well with the hard to engage people, especially in mental health. I'm not sure why they've taken it away, because that worked also out of hours. And I think you've made a valid point, Mike and Patrick, about time and engagement, because the most important thing in our work is about building a relationship with the person where they can trust you, where even in their, you know, moments of contemplating suicide, they can pick up the phone and say, I'm feeling suicidal, I'm thinking of this, and reaching out to someone. So it's about saving lives. And I know the assertive outreach, and me being an AMP as well, that has worked. You know, I was also a frontline clinician. I think once you build that trust, but that can, you know, talking about out of hours, I'm not sure if we'll ever get the assertive outreach model back. It seemed to be really good, especially, I think the challenge we have in mental health is when they use substances. So that's, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Lakeisha. Okay, and Kari, you've got your hand up, so I'm coming to you next.
Yeah, I was just going to respond to Lakeisha's point about assertive outreach teams. So within Oxley's community mental health services, we're currently going through a redesign, and part of that is looking at the way the community mental health teams work. So at the moment, it's individual care coordinators working with individual people, but we're moving to a model where we'll have care teams within the teams, and one of those will be an assertive outreach team. So they'll have a smaller caseload to try and help engage kind of people that are more complex or difficult to engage and things like that. So it'd be interesting to see what impact that may have on those kind of cases, I guess.
Yeah, it's really good, really good.
Yeah.
Patrick,
I
you
just
don't need to put your hand up.
Well, no, so I've just got a couple of points. Just a couple of points in response to Mike's presentation. I thought it was really interesting, Mike. You raised that issue about the coercive and controlling influence of criminals, in this case, drug dealers, on someone, and because often what we've considered in the domestic abuse world is about and learning about the risk of suicide in domestically abusive relationships where there's coercion and control. What's interesting, I suppose, is Mike's review highlights also the risks of coercion and control in a non-personally connected relationship. So I think that's an interesting bit for us to be aware of. And similarly, also, Mike, the point you made there about maybe a drug dealer coming along to an appointment with her as well, which is quite shocking, really. But and again, in domestic abuse services, a pretty strong recognition and warning about, the last thing you want is actually to have the perpetrator of abuse in the same meeting, because of course the person, whoever's being abused will never disclose abuse in front of them. And it's actually one of the warning signs to look out for, that someone is actually being coerced and controlled. If they have a partner who comes in, is overbearing, talks for them in meetings, won't let them see people separately as well. So I think it's really interesting points, Mike, you've raised there about almost applying some of the things we've learned from domestic abuse more widely into the drug and alcohol field?
Well, thank you, Patrick. Let me just add to that. I mean, it's very easy. It would be easy for you or me to say, well, workers just shouldn't allow these individuals into the meetings. And I was faced with this situation on a separate SAR that I wrote in the northeast of England. And what the question that staff raised is, sometimes it's not that easy to keep the person out. We don't feel safe in trying to keep that person out. And so you do have to have support systems around to help the workers to keep those individuals out. It's not a simple, you don't allow them in. There's more to it than that.
No, definitely. I think it's a really good point. I mean, I don't want to just talk over if anybody else got any questions, but there's a little bit. I did a review which looked at a number of cases of cuckooing, and one of these was a situation where someone was being cuckooed, and they had care needs, and actually there were care workers commissioned to go in, and the people, the drug dealers who were cuckooing, and the care workers did everything possibly they could do to not come into contact with each other. They would move from room to room, essentially. The care workers did not want at all to have anything to do with these people and understand the risks also they were placing themselves at. And of course, the drug dealers didn't want any witnesses. So consequently, this strange dance every day took place in this person's home as everybody moved from one room to the other without noticing each other at all. So sometimes it is that recognition sometimes about those safety matters, I think, is really important for us to be aware of too.
Yes. And I mean, it's probably not popular to say it, but sometimes the abusers do also care.
Yes.
And they may be providing care that no one else is providing. They are going and getting the shopping, but they're also ripping the person off. And it's a very difficult balance there.
Okay.
Cool.
Oh, we've got
one more.
One more question, Vicky. We'll come to you.
I think sometimes people become so dependent on other people, and they don't want to change patterns, routine, or they're in a cycle where they don't want to break, and because they're frightened to be left alone, or they're frightened to be, and sometimes it's about digging and digging. But I think a lot of services, many years ago I used to work for mental health services, but a lot of them services have gone, like the community day centres or anything like that. That's all gone. So I think there's nowhere for people to feel or go to have a talk or express what their concerns are. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you, Vicky.
Thank you.
Just one quick comment from me, if that's okay. I was just thinking about obviously SARS, we're learning from things that have sadly gone wrong, but I know there's things within those reviews around good practice as well, and I think sometimes that's important to learn from that as well. And I know in the case of Max, I think there was some really good practice with mental health services really engaging with him just on the street, would see him and say hello, and they did build sort of those good relationships. And then with Iliya as well, the GP's use of the translator, I think you mentioned, was a really good area of good practice. So a lot of the times we can learn from the good practice, and I just want to do a little plug here that we're really keen to have examples of cases where there's been good practice and good outcomes for the resident. So if people are aware of those cases, because I'm sure you're all doing brilliant work, please do get in touch with me, because we would love to bring those to our Safeguarding Adults Review evaluation group, where we do consider cases whether they meet the threshold for a SAR, but we also want to bring good practice cases as well. So if you know of any, please do get in touch with me, because that would be really good for us to share across the partnership as well.
Yeah, great idea.
Okay, I don't think we've got any other questions, and we've got only 4 minutes, so 4 minutes back of your afternoon. Just a massive thank you again to Patrick and Mike. Thank you so much, and take care. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Very
Bye.
much. Bye. Bye.
Right, thank you.
Good.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.